give the call to the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to say something in the debate on this piece of legislation. As the member for Fisher observed, around the world at a time of COVID-19, nations are considering their circumstances at a time when we reflect on matters of national security and broad public well-being. Countries have an interest in ensuring that there's appropriate regard given to how we own and control certain essential parts of our economy and our public service delivery world, and that has been true here in Australia. This bill essentially provides greater capacity to screen proposed foreign investments in Australia. There's always been a regime in place, the Foreign Investment Review Board, that has facilitated that kind of screening. Typically, there are certain areas where consideration is particularly relevant. There are value thresholds that are set, and if you fall below a particular value threshold, you may not be subject to screening. In this case, in the circumstances of a global pandemic, Australia, like other countries, is reconsidering how we apply that screen, that filter to proposed investments, so that we can be sure of protecting Australia's national interest. Now, I would observe that this change, to some degree, runs against some of the things that have been done in recent trade agreements, whether they're bilateral or multilateral trade agreements, because Foreign Investment Review Board settings are often part of trade agreements. And in Australia's case, because we are a virtually tariff-free jurisdiction, when it comes to settling trade agreements, we have to think about the kinds of things we can negotiate with, and they include intellectual property rights. They can sometimes include, wrongly in my view, temporary foreign labour access without proper testing, labour market testing and so on. They can certainly go to the conditions in which investment is allowed, and including the Foreign Investment Review Board settings. So there have been a number of trade agreements where we've essentially said to other countries that part of what we're prepared to offer them is different thresholds. And of course, when you come along with the change that's being made in this bill, you basically take that back to zero. So if there's an appropriate national security concern, then it doesn't matter how low the quantum of the investment is, it can still be called in and looked at. Of course, we note on this side, while agreeing to the bill, that there are aspects of the way that the bill will work that are yet to be determined, because the definition of national security business and the definition of national security land will be determined by regulation subsidiary to this bill. But certainly it's already the case that some of the countries with whom we've entered into trade agreements in recent time have noted with some concern the kinds of changes that are being made here. I think it was Mexico back in October that is one of the signatories to the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11 that expressed some concern about what Australia was doing with respect to investment screening. So it does beg the question going forward about how that will change the investment landscape globally. I also say, as a person who's spoken many times about the dangers of investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, that it's quite possible that investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms would be used to challenge the kind of thing that we're proposing here. You know, it's not out of the question that that a nation whose company is seeking to invest in Australia and is blocked on national security or national interest grounds may seek to challenge that in one of these tribunals, and that's something that we should be concerned about. It's right that we should look to review what's being done by this bill in a relatively short period of time, in 6 to 12 months. It's something that was first proposed in June. We're putting it in place now in December. There have been many concerns raised by stakeholders, investment experts and civil society groups about how exactly this will work. And as I said earlier, there are some aspects of it definitionally which haven't been established yet. So it's right that we'll have a good look at it shortly. Deputy Speaker, broadly the bill goes to this question of how do we protect Australia's national interest and Australia's national security. In that area broadly, foreign investment, foreign ownership, sovereign capability and self-sufficiency, there are many bits and pieces. And this part, which just goes to how you screen and consider proposed foreign investment, is only part of it. And as we do this, it's worth all of us in this place reflecting, I certainly think the government reflecting on some of the other key areas around national security and national interest control. I don't think there's any doubt that this government was a bit late to the game in relation to critical commodities. We're blessed in Australia, in addition to having a lot of traditional resources, to also be well represented when it comes to so-called new energy metals, the kinds of resources that are going to be necessary in the renewable energy transformation that is occurring around the world. We should have, I think, much earlier taken a comprehensive look at those resources, how important they are, where they are, who's investing in them, what purposes they're used for, and so on. Because the definition of critical commodity is something that is rare, but something that is also vitally important. The United States got going on this front earlier than Australia did, probably back in 2017. I think they landed their strategy. The Morrison government strategy wasn't settled until last year. But some of the observations in the US strategic assessment were sobering. The US identified 31 critical minerals. I think 14 of the 31 were entirely imported. So of the 31, more than a third, close to a half of those critical minerals, the United States is entirely reliant on imports. We have joined with the United States in looking at a couple of minerals in recent times where you could almost say the ship has sailed. There are a couple of key minerals that China currently controls around 85 to 90% of the global production of those minerals, and it would be healthier for the globe if critical minerals were not concentrated necessarily in that way. Certainly critical for Australia. So I think that's something that the government should look a bit more closely at in future. When you think about areas of national security and national interest where that question of protecting Australian ownership has already disappeared, there's none that sticks out more plainly and more worryingly than Australian shipping. 99% I think of imports and exports to Australia go by ship. Not surprising, we're an island continent. 3 decades ago, our national merchant fleet had 100 ships, 100 owned and flagged Australian vessels. That's an issue the member for Maribyrnong has identified and argued about repeatedly over the last 5 years plus. It's why Labor went to the last election with a proposal to create an Australian strategic fleet. So we talk about Australian ownership and national security and our capacity to be masters of our own destination, from 100 ships in our merchant fleet 3 decades ago to 10. That's where we sit now, and not a single Australian flagged and owned fuel tanker. That's no basis to maintain your sovereign self-sufficiency and your security position when you are a continent, an island continent. And yet that's not just what has been allowed to happen. It's actually a positive policy of neglect that coalition governments, both this one and the previous coalition government, have prosecuted. The sort of almost laughable use of permanent temporary permits that have meant that our shipping might, by some people's estimation, have become more efficient, but have made us really vulnerable. And it's not just the assets themselves, it's not just the ships that we no longer own, that are no longer flagged here, it's the maritime workforce that goes with that shipping. And one thing we've certainly discovered through COVID-19 is if you want to take a fast and loose, just-in-time inventory management approach to all the things that we rely on and all the things that come here by ship, you're going to get caught out if there's a global crisis. If there's any kind of interference or separation as far as freight and logistics on a national basis, Australians are going to get hurt, and they're going to get hurt quite quickly. So from a government that does bang the national security drum, it's one of their favourite instruments, they bang the national security drum a lot, you cannot be serious about our national security and turn a blind eye to the circumstances of Australian shipping. It is a scandal. It is a scandal. And the member for Kennedy is quite right, because if you go from shipping, you take the next step, you go to our liquid fuel insecurity. When you don't own and operate an Australian tanker, and you're relying on foreign shipping to get liquid fuel to you, you'd be doubly worried when you consider that at various times we've only got 20-odd days of liquid fuel. And that position has been in place for many years, and the government has been incredibly slow to do anything about it. We were supposed to get the final report of the review into liquid fuel security at the end of 2017. We still haven't got it. We still haven't got that report. We've been out of compliance with our IEA requirements for some time. We're the only country, I think, out of compliance. We are supposed to be lodging a strategy shortly to be back in compliance by 2026. I will not hold my breath. And things in many ways are getting worse before they get better, because we've seen in my own home state of Western Australia the proposal to close the BP refinery. It's not the case that BP and that refinery is the only one that's in trouble. Other refineries are in trouble as well. That means we won't be importing crude potentially. We have to rely on refined fuel, and that puts us at greater risk.
First Amendment, not the second.
So, Deputy Speaker, we support this bill, but there are many other areas of national security interest that the government should attend to and hasn't done a great job of over the last 7 years.